Hi, I'm Dr. Winston York. I'm a software engineer, but I'm also very interested in elections and voting systems. And this fall, my province of British Columbia is holding a referendum on whether or not to adopt proportional representation as our voting system. And I'm making this series of videos to help those voters, particularly those conservative voters, make an informed decision about how to vote in this important referendum. The biggest difference you're going to see in transitioning to proportional representation is the end of majority governments. Under proportional representation, almost all governments would be minority or coalition governments instead of majority governments. Now, the reason for this is that under FirstPastThePost, one party almost always wins a majority. And that's because the party that's most popular province-wide typically is most popular in most of the ridings of the province and therefore wins a majority of the seats. And since that party has a majority of the seats in the parliament, and they always vote with the party can do whatever it wants because they're going to win every vote in the legislature. This wouldn't happen under proportional representation because in order to get a majority of the seats in the legislature, you would actually have to get a majority of the province to vote for you. And this very rarely happens. Instead, parties would have to cobble together a number of different parties together into a coalition in order to form government. However, this is not as different from the status quo as it may first seem, because all political parties are coalitions. This is most obvious with the BC Liberals, who would identify themselves as a coalition of federal Liberals and Conservatives. But it's also true of the federal Conservatives, who would consist of groups such as Social Conservatives, Free Market Defenders, and Red Tories. And likewise, it's true of all political parties, whether here in Canada or elsewhere around the world. All political parties are coalitions. So, if we adopt proportional representation, it's not as though we're introducing this concept of a coalition which doesn't exist. The coalitions are already here. The difference between FirstPastThePost and proportional representation, thus, isn't whether or not we have coalition governments. We have coalition governments one way or the other. The question is when those coalitions form. Under FirstPastThePost, those coalitions have to form before the election. Whereas under proportional representation, those coalitions form after the election. And the reason for this is vote splitting. Two parties cannot contest an election competing for the same voters without splitting the vote and causing both parties to lose. But that's not the case under proportional representation. Under proportional representation, if two parties contest an election competing for similar voters, they'll simply split those voters between them and split the seats. And they can form a coalition with those other parties after the election. As a consequence, they're not forced into joining together into coalition before the election in order to have a chance at being elected. As a consequence, they can actually contest the election separately and form the coalition afterwards, which is what they do. So, the question comes down to, is it better to form coalitions before the election, as we do under FirstPastThePost, or is it better to form the coalition after the election, as we do under proportional representation? Your vote is doing different things in these two systems. In FirstPastThePost, your vote is primarily trying to control who actually forms government. But under proportional representation, your vote is primarily delegating your support to a particular party who will use that support both during the negotiation process in forming a government as well as ongoing throughout the lifetime of the legislature. So a lot of the objections or arguments made both for and against proportional representation really come down to this idea of coalitions. And often what's being missed is the fact that we have coalitions in either system. And the differences are more subtle, which is not to say there are not any differences, and we'll be looking at those differences in this forthcoming series of videos.